Well, good morning, and thank you, Carl. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Paul. Arthur Politist I go by on Facebook. That's another story altogether. It's Paul Wade's my name. And my family moved here about 5 years ago to Sale. And I'm first going to tell you about Pokemon Go. Has anyone heard of Pokemon Go?
No.
No? Well, it's a silly game you play on your phone. And that's how this YouTube channel started. It was with a game called Pokemon Go. My young fella wants to be a YouTuber. All the kids want to be YouTubers, even the big kids want to be YouTubers. So it started with this game called Pokemon Go. And it's kind of like sat-nav on your phone. And you go around and you catch these little critters. And you're thinking to yourself, God, he's not even here 2 minutes and he's on a tangent. Well, that's the name of this talk today. It's not a tangent, it's a segue. So Pokemon Go is this silly game where you go around, you catch these little characters, and that guy's called a Mankey. And you catch them and you make them fight each other. So this was the kind of videos we were making at first with my son. But the thing that's of interest to me, or that became of interest to me, are these little things that'll just happen here in a second now. These things here. These things are called Pokestops. And this is Worthington Park, actually. It's a real world map. It's a GPS. It's like your sat-nav. So these little blue things here are called Pokestops. And they're things in the real world, like the J.P. Jewell statue, for instance, in Worthington Park. So those things became of interest to me, and because you get a little history lesson with them. Now, here's one on Framingham Road in my neighborhood. This is a King Edward VIII pillar box. And if you click on the thing in your phone while you're playing the game, you get a little description of what it is. King Edward VIII pillar box, post box dating from the reign of Edward VIII, king from January 1936 until his abdication in December the same year. So he was king for such a short time that there were really not many coins or stamps or pillar boxes made for him. So people come from all over the world to find these pillar boxes. People that, fans of Edward and Mrs. Simpson, come to find these things. And there's one on Framingham Road in Brooklands. So the Edward VIII pillar box made an appearance in a couple of our Pokemon Go videos.
What is the name Pillar? Why play Pillar?
Pardon me?
What's the Pillar from? Pillar. The name Pillar.
I assume that was the name of the thing, it's post box.
Is it the shape?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know where the name came from other than the shape of it, yeah. So there were, so my son kind of lost interest in Pokemon Go. It's more of a game for little kids. I still play it from time to time. Whenever I go to a new place, I'll look, and because it'll point out things that you wouldn't know were there. For instance, well, whatever. There's things everywhere, these Pokestops. They're all over the world. Anyway, it's not an endorsement of Pokemon Go. I'm not getting paid by Pokemon Go. But my son kind of lost interest in Pokemon Go and making these YouTube videos. So I kind of took over, and Brooklyn Station is a Pokestop. And this was the first video we made about Sale.
In 1849, when the Manchester South Junction and Altrincham Railway opened, no one ever thought that there would be a Pokestop in Brooklands, nor did they think there would be a railway station. It was one of the first truly suburban railways and was instrumental in the development of its hinterland. There were stations at Sale and Timperley, and in 1855, 45 residents at Marsland Bridge petitioned for a local station to be built.
So of course, if you've seen it, it goes on to tell the history of the Brooklyn station, how it got its name, Samuel Brooks, and how Brooklyn's got its name. And that was our first Sale history video. And next, we're also, my wife and I were both involved with the Scouts, Sale 14 Scouts. And yours all? So I was asked to help out with the Air Researcher badge is one of the badges the Scouts get. And what can I do? So I came up with this idea that connected my old hometown and my new hometown through this video.
Almost familiar.
So that's a Vickers Vimy World War I bomber. And it's the same kind of plane that was used by two young men from Manchester after the war, 1919. They were the first to fly non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean. And they left from my old hometown of St. John's, Newfoundland. There they are, John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown. And that's one of the most famous photos in aviation history. That's the Vickers Vimy taken off from Leicester's Field in St. John's. The St. John's is, who was asking me about Nova Scotia? Nova Scotia. So St. John's, Nova Scotia is over here. This is St. John's, Newfoundland. This is the province of Newfoundland, and Labrador is up here. So this is the most easterly point in North America. Can't get any farther. It's all water after there. And yeah, they say what we lack in history, we make up for in geography. Mm-hmm. So I did a bit of math, and if you were to, sorry, I've gone ahead there. If you were to leave Manchester and fly to St. John's, Newfoundland, here we go. If you were to make that journey, well, if you were to continue on from Newfoundland, heading west, the same distance, it would get you to a place called Flin Flon, Manitoba. So it's only about halfway across the country. That's how big Canada is. But I'm from a place over here on the East Coast. This is where I lived most of my life, in St. John's, Newfoundland. Now you'll forgive me, I don't get to brag about my own hometown much. My old hometown. You've all heard me brag about my new hometown. But let me brag about my old hometown for a minute. It's so I spent most of my life in this place, St. John's, Newfoundland. But I actually grew up in central Newfoundland, just west of Gander. You may have heard of Gander. I grew up in a place called Bishop's Falls. Now, you may have heard of Gander. Gander was the largest airport in the world. You can see how the runway dominates the landscape there. And if you had to go across the pond in the 60s, up until the 60s, you stopped in Gander. Everybody did. And this is a funny little thing here. If you notice, this is the original town. And if you look closely, the original town layout is in the shape of a duck's head, of a goose's head. It's a gander. And that's intentional. It was intentionally laid out that way. So it was the largest piece of tarmac on the planet for a long, long time. It was an alternate landing site for the space shuttle. It never happened, but it was one of the places the space shuttle would land in an emergency if they couldn't land in Canaveral. But yeah, if you were flying across the pond well into the 60s, you had to stop in Gander because planes couldn't make it without refueling. They had to stop in Gander. Whether you were going east, west, didn't matter. you stopped in Gander. So anyone who is anyone has been to Gander, Newfoundland. I spent a lot of time in Gander. It was just a few miles from my hometown. Now, you may have heard of Gander from the 9/11 attacks in, of course, September 11th, 2001. The U.S. closed their airspace that morning. And at that time, there was at least 238 planes over the Atlantic Ocean. The U.S. closed their airspace, and they were all diverted to Canadian airports. We had to deal with their mess. So, yes, so 75 of those planes were sent to Newfoundland, and 38 were sent to Gander. Gander, at the time, had a population of just around 10,000. On those 38 planes, there was almost 7,000 people. So the population of the town almost doubled in an instant. You may have heard of it because two of those 6,000 odd people were Broadway producers. And they wrote a musical about it, their stay in Gander, because as you can imagine, a town of just over 10,000 or just around 10,000 people didn't have accommodations for another 10,000 people. So they were put up in places like this, in school gymnasiums, and taken into people's homes. They spent the first day in the airplanes. So can you imagine spending a full day inside an airplane? So these people were really appreciated. You know, can you imagine that? It's just the toothpaste and toilet paper for another town's worth of people. Gander really went out of its way. And these two Broadway producers were so taken by their reception in Gander that they wrote a musical about it. That actually played here in Manchester not too long ago. My wife had to come from away to see Come From Away. Come From Away is a saying we have in Newfoundland. So anybody who visits Newfoundland has come from away. Sometimes we say CFA. So anybody that visits is called CFA. You can say it with disdain too. This is a friend of mine. She was actually one of the stars of the. It's still running on Broadway. It was a huge success. As I said, it was just here in Manchester and in London as well. But of course, on that day, yeah, there was people married. There was relationships that still maintained to this day with people that stayed in Gander. So it was quite the thing. Now, everybody remembers where they were on that day, and of course, I'm no exception because I was. I'm pretty sure I was the only person on the planet doing what I was doing that day. I was cutting down a Christmas tree. On September 11th, I was cutting down a Christmas tree. So, for those of you that haven't heard me speak about these things before, I used to work in film and television, and I was in this place. This is a little McMansion, a manor home built by one of our St. John's moguls. He never lived in it. He died before it was completed. But it's an amazing house. It's now a bed and breakfast. And we were shooting a Christmas special in this building on September 11th. Now, St. John's is a lot bigger than Gander, but still, we don't have, so St. John's got the other half of the planes, but of course, we don't have the accommodations for thousands and thousands of extra people in an instant. So they were put up in places like this, bed and breakfast. So even though CBC television had booked the bed and breakfast to shoot this Christmas special, the end of the world takes precedence, right? Mm-hmm. So these people were sent everywhere. And I just can't imagine how these people felt. You know, they're on a plane, flying to wherever in the world, Los Angeles or wherever, trying to make important meetings, and they're forced down into this place they've never heard of before, and they get off the plane and they find out that the world's coming to an end and there's planes flying into buildings and we're going to war. And so, okay, where are we going to stay? And they find themselves a bed and breakfast. They go to this place and they walk up the steps and go inside, and it's Christmas. It must have been like walking into an episode of The Twilight Zone. It must have been absolutely surreal for these people. It was a surreal day for everyone anyway, but I just can't imagine what these people went through. But if you, back to Gander, Gander was also home of the Concorde. Of course, we have the Concorde here in Manchester as well. But when Concorde first started, nobody wanted Concorde. It was too dangerous, too fast, too loud, whatever. No one wanted Concorde. But Gander was the home of two of the first prototypes of Concorde. And they were doing the cold weather training for cold weather for the machine to see how it would react in cold weather. So for the first 2 years before commercial flight, there were two Concordes in Gander. And of all the people in the world that have flown on Concorde, the people of Gander are the most, because they offered free flights on Concorde to the people of Gander. They could go down and fly to England, no charge, on the Concorde. And one of those people that didn't do it was my father. He worked in Gander at the time. And I got him to later admit that he was afraid of flying. But I assure you, I would not have missed the chance to fly on Concorde had I been offered. There's one of them at Gander. Do you remember boarding the plane that way? Before the covered walkways? The stairs on the back of the truck there?
Still have to walk upstairs in places now.
It's Gander.
Manchester. Yeah.
So on the way into Gander was this beauty. On a pedestal, on a plinth outside, just before you get into the airport, was this airplane up on a pedestal. And that is a Hudson bomber in her RAF colors. Now, one of the things about Gander was it was ideally situated during the Second World War. And you remember you were in desperate need of airplanes in the Second World War. And this is an American-built plane, the Hudson bomber. And she was built in somewhere on the west coast of America. But America was neutral at the time. So the planes would be brought to the Canadian border, and the Canadians would go across the border and tow them across by horse. I've never been able to figure out why it had to be done by horse. It's an odd thing. I guess it had something to do with the United States neutrality at the beginning of the war. They had to tow them across the border by horse. And of course, the United States was only selling airplanes. They weren't selling bombers, just airplanes, not bombers. No, we're not supplying bombers to Britain. We're neutral. So the planes would be brought across the border, and they'd install bomb bays and turrets, etc., armaments on these planes. At the beginning, they would put the planes on ships and send them across the Atlantic, because if you remember at the time, your bombers couldn't even make it to Germany and back, so you're not flying this thing across the Atlantic, right? So they were put on ships. Of course, it took forever to get the ships across the Atlantic. One ship gets sunk, you lose a dozen planes. It happened a lot. And Churchill was desperate for planes. So they came up with this idea. This guy, Lord Beaverbrook came up with the idea. This is a movie that we worked on called Above and Beyond. And we actually shot this movie on the Gander runway. This is where Lord Beaverbrook, the movie it's quite a good movie. It's on YouTube. It's called Above and Beyond, but it's really grainy. It's a really bad copy of it, but it's the only copy of it that I know of. And it's a good story. You get the story of Ferry Command. So that's what it became called, Ferry Command. So they started flying the planes from Gander to this side of the pond, Ireland, I think. There's the recreation of the airport we built. So there's that very Hudson bomber that was on the plinth at the top of the plinth. The weather doesn't cooperate. That snow and stuff, it was the hottest day ever. So we had to recreate that kind of thing. This is Bennett. He was the lead guy in flying the planes over. And I remember my father getting up on my dad's shoulders, trying to touch that plane when I was a little kid when he worked in Gander, you know. I wanted desperately to get inside it. And when we worked on this movie, I got to crawl all over that plane. So it was a boyhood dream come true. So they were the heart of Ferry Command. 25,000 airplanes came from Gander. 25,000 airplanes, including Lancaster. Lancaster was built in Canada. You may know we have the other flying Lancaster, Vera. So a lot of those Lancasters that we used over here during the war were built in Canada. And of course, the rest were built here in Manchester. There I am. There's my name at the end of the credits there. So yeah, the Hudson bomber was a fantastic machine. It was actually, it's in contention. There's two planes in contention for this. It's the first plane to shoot down a German plane in Britain. And another is a Hurricane, but I think it was actually the Hurricane that did it. But if you look up the Hudson bomber, she also claims first shooting down the plane. Another one of those planes was this beauty, and this one's in our RAF colors. It's another American plane, and another one in Ferry Command that was brought over from Gander, and it's called the Catalina. But of course, most of them were built in Canada, and we call it the Canso. And I believe she was the first to, she didn't sink a sub, but she forced it to surrender, the Canso. And this one here, actually this photo here, or picture, is the one that spotted the Bismarck. So it was a very important plane back in the day. And a real beauty that was stationed in Gander because after the war they were turned into water bombers and they were used for fighting forest fires. And I got to crawl all over these beauties too. And they were in service up until the 90s. Like Vera, the Lancaster, she was in service until mid-60s. She was still in service in St. John's, Coast Guard, I believe. And yeah, so these guys are used for fighting forest fires. And I'll just play a bit of this video here of the Canso in action. So that's Newfoundland and Labrador's forestry colors there. So yeah, we had a whole squadron of these things. They've since been replaced by CL-215 and CL-415, which is the same plane, it's just not 80 years old. So they're a little bit more powerful. But this thing is used for fighting forest fires. It lands on the water, skims along, and picks up 8,000 pounds of water in about 15 seconds. And then she can drop that in about 2 seconds. And on average, there's about 100 forest fires a year in Newfoundland, and they're absolutely devastating. That's just Newfoundland, not Canada. That's just that little island I showed you at the beginning of this video, of this talk. So the Canso was amazing, absolutely amazing airplane. And when I was looking for a video to show you guys, I found this. This is on the Labrador Highway. There's two parts to the province, Newfoundland and Labrador. Labrador is the mainland part of the province. And this is the Labrador Highway. It's a very isolated highway. And there's no nearby fire service. So this tractor trailer has smashed into this grader on the Labrador Highway, and it caught fire. No nearby fire service, so they sent in a water bomber to put out the fire. This is pretty amazing. You just watch her come in. She's got a bit of crosswind there, but I absolutely love this shot. It's almost like she hovers. Her wings are massive, 2 feet wider than a Lancaster. Amazing, isn't it? There's nothing else can do that. So as I was telling you, I grew up in Bishop's Falls, and we just experienced when I was first asked to do this talk. At the time, there was the biggest forest fire in the last 60 years in central Newfoundland. So that's Gander and Bishop's Falls, that area. And it was the largest fire ever. At the end, when the fire was finally put out, it took 2-3 weeks to put the fire out. And we have a whole squadron of planes like that. So you can imagine the size of this fire. Well, I'll tell you the size of this fire. It was 11,000 hectares. I did the math. That's the entirety of Trafford and more. That's how much was burned in this fire. It's an incredible amount of land. And they had to evacuate.
Did it start spontaneously, sorry?
Sorry?
With the fire, did it start spontaneously?
I actually don't know the cause of the fire, but they do start spontaneously. But more often than not, it's careless campers or, yeah, it's usually caused by human not taking care of.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, it's a terrible thing. But also there was a large paper mill in Grand Falls, which is right next door to Bishop's Falls. A huge paper mill, and it's since shut down because who needs newsprint anymore, right? So the paper mill is shut down. So the forest is not being cut anymore. So when they were logging, making paper, you know, they were cutting roads, and so you get all these fire breaks caused by the roads, and there was less dead wood on the forest floor. Now trees just die, fall. So yeah, it's a tinderbox now, and of course you know what the weather's been like this summer. It was the same on that side of the pond as well. So I figured I'd just show you, if I was going to talk about anything this morning, it had to be planes, trains, and fire engines for a group of men. So this is the Bishop's Falls Fire Department. Just take note of this thing here. That's a siren on top of the fire hall. And there's our old fire trucks. I don't know any of these people. They weren't even thought of when I left there. But there's our fire trucks. They're probably the same ones they had when I lived there back in the 80s. And yeah, there we go. Yeah, it looks like late 80s model. So I figured if I was going to talk about anything today, it would be planes and trains and fire engines for a group of men. But remember, as I said at the beginning, it's not a tangent, it's a segue. So does anybody recognize this building in the background here?
Brooklyn's Hotel.
Yeah, Brooklyn's Hotel, you got it. So that is featuring in our upcoming video about the Brooklyn's Hotel. And I'll just play a little animation that I've made for the video. It's Brooklands Hotel, Monday evening, 9th of July, 1909. One of the barmaids, Miss Wilson, is returning to the hotel. She notices smoke coming from the roof of the southwestern gable. So that siren I showed you at the beginning of the Bishop's Falls video there, Bishop's Falls is a volunteer fire department. So back when I was living there, I guess now they do it by cell phone when you need to contact your volunteer firemen. I guess they just phone them. I don't know what happens now. But back when I was living there, they would set off this siren in the middle of town, and the men would leave their work and whatever they were working at, go to the fire department, respond to the fire. Well, Sale and Ashton upon Mersey had the same kind of thing, but they of course had a bell in the town hall, and it was they used St. Anne's Church at first, but they got their own bell later installed in the fire hall on the back of the town hall. So how the message got from the Brooklands Hotel to town hall, I don't know. That part of the story is lost. But somebody either had to run all the way from the Brooklands Hotel to the town hall, or maybe somebody could have gone to the Brooklyn station, wired to Sale station maybe, I don't know. We don't know how the message got there. But the message got to the fire station, and I was just moaning about the old 80s and 90s fire trucks from the Bishop Falls Fire Department. Well, this was the Sale and Ashton on Mersey Fire Brigade in 1909. They didn't get motorized vehicles till 1911. Here they are practicing. It's at the library. That's another view of the library, practicing. More of their equipment. So they had to pull that from the town hall to the Brooklands Hotel. Sometimes they would, conscript horse cabs from, they used to be in the same place that you see them now, the taxis. So that's the same place they would be back in the early 1900s as well, but of course horse-drawn. So they would conscript some of those horses sometimes. Other times, if there wasn't one there, you just pulled it by hand, off they went. So can you imagine pulling something like that from there to, actually the first fire they responded to was Sale Old Hall, so even farther. So they weren't formed long before this event, but they had an ace up their sleeve on that day. They had this guy. This guy is John Johnson Hunt, and he was a veteran of the Manchester Fire Brigade. He had served with the Manchester Fire Brigade for 30 years, and he retired and moved to Sale. He was retired for a couple of years, and of course the Council of Sale and Ashton on Mersey approached him to be the superintendent of the Sale Fire Department, which hadn't formed long before. So he was kind of in retirement and kind of took on the role of superintendent for the Sale and Ashton on Mersey Fire Brigade. And so he was more like a father figure, training them, I guess. But he did respond to the Brooklands fire. He did go into fires as well. What's this quote here? Oh yeah, they said that in Manchester, so this guy had been in Manchester for 30 years, in the Manchester Fire Brigade, and they said if there was anywhere, if you wanted to build a place to burn down as fast as it could, you'd base it on Manchester. Because there was, you know, all that greasy machinery, and all those cotton fibers, and all that cotton laying around in warehouses. And it was just a tinderbox. So when these places caught fire, they were gone. And he was a veteran of these fires. He'd been decorated several times. So here he is on the left here when he became superintendent, on his horse there. So he was decorated many times. You can see his medals here in this photo. Gotten several medals for. There was one story of a fire he responded to. This was in 1885, I believe, this fire happened in Manchester. And what a brave man. I mean, you can't even believe the stuff these guys had, because they had no equipment. I mean, all they had was a helmet and an axe. That was it. You know, their breathing apparatus was a wet rag. They had nothing. These guys were amazing. So this guy was trapped on several stories up in a fire, and John Johnson Hunt climbed up to the roof and then climbed down onto the parapet above his window, lowered a rope down to him. He tied himself out, and Hunt swung him up to a ladder. Standing on a little ledge, swinging a guy on a rope out to a ladder. So it's incredible. His bravery is just amazing. So he, as I said, he was decorated several times. They even wrote a song about him. This is from one of the Manchester newspapers. And we have all this stuff because he kept a scrapbook. It was a common thing that firemen did at the time, that these scrapbooks were supplied to them. So his scrapbook has been kept. And I met up with this guy. This is John Johnson Hunt's great-grandson. And this is Jeffrey Price. He's the great-grandson of John Johnson Hunt. Jeffrey, you want to tell us a little bit about your great-grandfather?
Yes, he was chief engineer of Manchester Fire Brigade until he retired in 1890, and then took on the role of chief of Sale Fire Brigade in 1890, for which he served until he died in 1909. He was quite a brave man, really. When he was working in Manchester, he went into many a fire to rescue people, and indeed that happened in 1909 when there was a fire at Woodlands Hotel. He went in and the roof beam fell on him, and as a result of that, a week later he died of his injuries.
Oh, it's incredible bravery.
Yep, certainly was, yeah. Over 120 years ago.
So the cat's out of the bag. John Johnson Hunt did not survive the Brooklands Hotel fire. He went in and burning the roof beam fell on him and he died. He survived the fire, but he died a couple days later in the hospital. And his funeral was held at St. Paul's. And it would have been the worst day for a fire to happen anywhere outside of Sale, because every fireman in what we now know as Greater Manchester was at his funeral. The funeral procession left St. Paul's. He's buried in Brooklyn Cemetery, and the entire route was lined with firemen. So every fireman in, as I said, what we know as Greater Manchester was at his funeral. So this all came to be from a video I did, Sale and Timperley 40 Steps Bridge. Anybody familiar with this bridge or know that video? Well, there's a bridge Anyway, that's all irrelevant. But at the end of the video, there's a shot of the Brooklands Hotel. And I mentioned in the video that I was going to do a video about Brooklands Hotel. And a fan of the channel contacted me and said, do you know about this John Johnson hunt? Of course I didn't, I knew nothing about it. And he said, you should put it in the video. I said, okay, well, let's find out, let's see what we can find out. He went on and did all this research and found these people, found this scrapbook, found his great-grandson, and so there's going to be a fantastic video coming up about this. Anthony Carmelo, he did all the research for this. He was a firefighter himself here in Sale, retired, and he knew about it because there's a picture of him, John Johnson Hunt, on the wall of the fire station. Nobody knew who he was, so this is a brand new story in the history of Sale. And Anthony went on to get a red plaque for John Johnson Hunt. The red plaque is going to be unveiled on the 28th of October at the Marsland building, which is where the Brooklands Hotel used to be. It's a red plaque. It's similar to the blue plaque, but it's for firefighters that have fallen in the line of duty. So that's going to be unveiled on the 28th of October. So I'm kind of proud that we had a very, very small part in making that happen. So that is my connection between the biggest fire in, in Canada and Sale. Not very much of a connection, but an interesting one. So that concludes our broadcast day. Any questions?